Great, thanks very much. So Rosie and I have been working on microbiome issues in autism for many years, along with Daewoo Kang, who's Rosie's postdoc and research scientist, now a professor at the University of Toledo. If you want more info, you can go to our website. We're going to do a 1-hour presentation in half an hour, so we're going to go fast. We have a number of patents, our colleagues and I, related to microbiota transplant and similar treatments for autism and other conditions. Microbiota transplant therapy is not an FDA-approved treatment. That's why we're doing the research we are, so it's an investigational product. A number of years ago, we did a study which showed that children with autism who had more gut problems also had greater severity of autism. And that's been verified in a number of studies, including some that were presented the last couple of days. There was a stunning study a number of years ago in 2000 on the use of vancomycin for treating GI problems in children with autism. They used an unusually long course of it, 8 weeks. The normal course is just 10 days. They found that it steadily improved GI symptoms, steadily improved autism symptoms, but as soon as the treatment was stopped, the benefits were lost within a month, even though some of the children were on standard probiotics. This was a big clue that gut bacteria were causing a number of problems, but that we needed something to help keep those gut bacteria from coming back. That was our hypothesis. And so let me turn it over to Rosie.
Can you hear me? I had been doing work on the gut microbiome for a few years, and I met Jim, and Jim convinced me that the question of the gut microbiome and autism was worth investigating with the two arguments that he just showed you. One, the vancomycin study, and two, the fact that many children in the spectrum have a lot of GI problems, and when those GI problems improve, their behavior improves also. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we started our work with the gut microbiome, and first a little bit about the gut microbiome, even though I know Sarkis covered some of it already. It's important to note that the gut microbiome is unique to each individual, and that it has a general stability throughout life, and general in quotations, and you will see why. It's affected by internal and external factors. So internal factors, the host, and everything that the host does, and external factors, also the environment, that affects the microbiome. It's altered and diseased, and it's strongly affected by residence time. What does that mean? You have seen in many of the presentations that constipation is one of the symptoms that comes up often. Constipation will change the residence time, will change the amount of time that food and bacteria travel through our GI system, and that will affect how the gut microbiome and which gut microbiome exists in each child. Also mentioned by my collaborator and friend Sarkis, the microbial genomes, or the microbiome in our body, are more than 100 times more than the genes that we have. So we are effectively 99% microbes, because at the gene level, we have more genes that are microbial than human. And this provides, of course, an opportunity. We started looking at the microbiome in kids with autism many years ago, and the first question we asked was, are the microbiomes of kids with autism and kids that are typically developing similar, or are they different? So we look at a small cohort of 20 children, and with these 20 children, the first thing that we looked at was that in this graph, you can see in red our kids with autism, and in blue or neurotypical kids. These are two different measurements of diversity. Diversity is how many different types of microbes exist in a sample. And you can see that with these two different indexes, it's not telling us a number of types of bacteria, but just an index. We could see that our kids that were typically developing had higher diversity. This is important because think about this. If you have 5 microbes that can do a job, or you have one, if it's like the workers, if you have 5 workers that can do one type of job and one of them gets sick, the other 4 can do the job. But if you only have one and that one gets sick, the job doesn't get done. Similar thing happens in the gut. So when we have different types of microbes that can do similar function, that helps a lot. So this is one of the reasons why high diversity is important. We also look at specific microbes that we're missing, and some of them are microbes that allow us to digest their food better, ferment their food. There were fermenters missing, and one of the fermenters that we saw a very strong signature on is this microbe called Prevotella. On blue, again, you can see our kids that are typically developing, and on red, you can see the kids with autism, and this is a heat map that shows you relative abundance of these microbes. And you can see a depletion in this heat map. It's very obvious. I don't even think I have to point it out. So it didn't depend on severity of GI symptoms, and it didn't depend on severity of autism either. It was just very strongly depleted. We actually replicated this in a second cohort also from kids from Arizona, but we replicated these two findings. One, that kids with autism had lower diversity, they were missing beneficial microbes, and that Prevotella was dramatically lower in children with autism. So we postulated that this is a potential probiotic or maybe biomarker.
Okay, so what that means in terms of treatment is if children with autism are missing hundreds of species of bacteria, but this child is missing these several hundred, and this child is missing these several hundred, then we want a broad spectrum probiotic. The problem is commercial probiotics are very limited. They contain only a few bacteria that are approved by the FDA. And these are generally aerobic bacteria that grow in milk culture. They don't include the anaerobic bacteria that are killed by oxygen that comprise a lot of our gut bacteria. So this suggests the best way to get a healthy set of microbiota is to transplant them from a healthy person into someone with autism. So one of our collaborators, Tom Barodi, is a gastroenterologist from Australia. His group has done over 17,000 microbiota transplants. He personally has done 5,000. He treated 9 children with autism. Unlike his C. diff patients, people who have life-threatening diarrhea, which kills 29,000 Americans a year, 1 dose of fecal transplant is enough to save their lives and cure them in 2 to 3 days. Autism was much, much harder to treat than a life-threatening GI disorder. It took months of therapy to improve. So he found that when he gave them, this is a direct quote from him, so I'll just read it. After 3 months of the cultured microbiota, which he gave every day, there was a substantial improvement in bowel function. Parents noticed a substantial reduction in the odor of their stool. Several children who started the study with abdominal cramps, which disrupted their sleep. By the end of the treatment, their abdominal cramps were reduced. They were able to sleep throughout the night. Parents reported marked increase in vocabulary, clear improvement on task performance, new ability to listen to parents' requests. So as a gastroenterologist, he was very surprised that treating the GI symptoms led to these improvements in autism symptoms. So he guided us in designing the treatment protocol that we used in the study that I'm going to tell you about. And the reason we use the word microbiota transplant is to emphasize it's a very intensive type of therapy, very different than its standard 1-dose therapy that's used for treating Clostridium difficile. So what we did was we treated with vancomycin for 2 weeks. That's an antibiotic that was used previously, shown to be beneficial temporarily for children with autism to remove harmful bacteria. And then we used MoviPrep, which is basically just a bowel cleanse like you'd have for a colonoscopy. We want to remove as much as possible of the person's original gut bacteria and then reimplant with beneficial bacteria from very healthy donors. Then we gave a high dose for 1 or 2 days, and then a low dose every day for 7 to 8 weeks. And we observed the changes. So we also gave a stomach acid suppressant Prilosec because we're giving these highly purified gut bacteria orally for the maintenance dose. Some children received the initial dose orally, some received it rectally. Microbiota were developed by our collaborators at the University of Minnesota. We previously demonstrated that this highly purified type, they take stool from very carefully screened donors. The screening process is so extensive that 90% of the general US population would not meet the criteria. We're using the 10% healthiest donors, and then they're screened very carefully and then purified, so it's to basically just 99% pure gut bacteria. And then in this study, we gave it in a liquid formulation. So we used a stomach acid suppressant. The stomach acid doesn't kill off the bacteria that we're giving them. We had 18 children with autism, ages 7 to 16 years, moderate to severe GI problems. Some had constipation, some had diarrhea. Many alternated between the two. We had to exclude a few of the very lowest functioning children. What was very interesting is that every one of these children had these GI problems since infancy. That wasn't something required, but they all said they had never had a period of normal health, and I've had many autism families tell me that since, although a few have developed them later in life. We found, just like in the original study, there was a temporary adverse effect, usually lasting for just a day or two, but sometimes lasting up to 3 weeks in one person. Generally, 7 of the 18 children developed mild to moderate hyperactivity. 5 children had increased tantruming and aggression. Again, very temporary, just a few days, and then they got better. So again, what we think is happening is that as the bacteria which were causing these problems die off, they're releasing all their toxins at once, causing an exacerbation of those symptoms, and then an improvement in those symptoms longer term. We now know that the children who have these reactions are the children who have worse of these symptoms to begin with, presumably then more of those bacteria to begin with as well. So very similar to what was seen in the previous study. So the initial results at the end of our 10 weeks of treatment saw an 80% reduction of GI symptoms. So 16 of 18 children were traumatic responders, 70 to 100% reduction of their symptoms, and we had 2 non-responders. And then initially there was about a 23% reduction in autism symptoms, and then we held our breath, waited 8 weeks to see if those benefits were stable or if we would lose them. Unlike in the Vancomycin study, where those benefits were lost, in our case, all of those benefits were stable 8 weeks later. And then Rosie's work discovered that, again, the microbiome diversity in this third cohort. Oh, you're going to talk about, all right, Rosie's going to talk about that coming up. So we stopped at that point, published our results. Then a year later, several families came up to me individually and said, Professor Adams, my son's doing better than ever. I said, that's very interesting. So after the third time, we then decided to do a follow-up study. Very rarely done. But 2 years after treatment, we followed up with all 18 of the participants. We had 0 dropouts. There were no additional treatment during those 2 years. But what we found is that there was a dramatic improvement in their symptoms. So we saw that initially, there was an 80% reduction in GI problems. 2 years later, most of those benefits had held. One child who was treated with antibiotics lost some of their benefits. That was a major difference. The autism symptoms, generally, family after family just had slow, steady improvement. The child just seemed to be able to learn better language, learn better social skills, better behavior. So initially we had about a 24% reduction in autism rating scale. The CARS is rated by a professional evaluator. 2 years later, our evaluator reported a 47% reduction. Again, this is an open label trial. There's some placebo effect, but much of that effect seems to be real. Our evaluator has participated in many previous studies, and she said she had never seen improvement like this. So bottom line is when we look at GI symptoms, rapid improvement, stable after 8 weeks, and then 2 years later, most of those GI benefits still stable. 1 is the bottom of the scale. If we look at the autism symptoms, so the bottom red line is the cutoff, it's approximately the cutoff for autism symptoms. The middle red line is the cutoff between mild to moderate versus severe autism. So if you look at the figure on the right, at the start of our study, roughly 80-some% of our children were in the severe range. At the end of our study 2 years later, only about 16% were in the severe range, about 40% were mild to moderate, and about 45% were below the cutoff for autism. Again, had some symptoms, but had seen a lot of improvement. When we looked at other scales like the SRS, which is a parent-rated scale, we see similar improvements, not quite as much, but very, very similar. And we also saw trends that the children who improved more in GI symptoms also had more improvement in the autism symptoms, a very strong correlation between those two groups, very statistically significant. So now let me turn it back to Rosie.
Thank you. So what we wanted to do with this treatment is to change the microbiome, to change the gut microbiota. So we look at the microbiota at baseline and at week 3, week 10, and 8 weeks after follow-up. And what you're looking at in this diagram is a measurement of diversity. With the thick orange is our initial donor, and with the thinner orange is our maintenance donor. The green line is the average diversity of a neurotypical child age match. And our box plots show our 18 children that were treated. So you can see that the diversity in the beginning was much lower than the kids typically developing, as we saw before. And as we treated these children, the diversity, of course, increased. On week 3, the diversity hasn't increased because first we had a bump of vancomycin going in, and this had to recover before diversity went up. And you can see that the diversity increased at week 10, and it looks like at week 18, diversity was even higher. So what happened 2 years later? When we came back to these children 2 years later, you can see that the diversity increased even more, and the diversity is even higher than the average diversity of our typically developing kids of the same age. What I think happened was that with this treatment, we were able to change the environment in the gut in such a way that now this environment was beneficial to retrieve and grow beneficial microbes, which was not the case before. So it wasn't just the inoculation of good microbes or the introduction of good microbes, but somehow the treatment managed to change the environment in a way that now it wasn't a beneficial environment to retrieve beneficial microbes. And we also look at how these children's guts recruited the microbes from the donor. How much of the microbes from the donor, how much did this gut microbiota look like the donor? This is a measurement of the similarity, which is unifrac. On green, you can see your neurotypical children. So 0.5 is the natural variation, is how similar you would be to the person that is sitting next to you or these children at that age. And if it's lower, it means that it's more similar. So we compare the children that we treated and how similar they were to their most recent donor. So if it was the high dose or the low dose maintenance donor. And you can see that as we treated these children, they were more similar to their donors at week 3 and at week 10. We don't know if it's staying there at week 18. It looks like they're losing some of that similarity to their donor. And at 2 years, they're not. They don't look like their donor. So I showed you, before I showed you how similar they are to their donor, that their diversity increased dramatically after 2 years. Now I'm showing you that this diversity is different to the donor. So these children, they don't look like they looked in the beginning of the treatment. They don't look like their donor. They have a new steady state. They have a new microbiota, a new type of beneficial microbiota, which is their own. It's not the donors, but it's their new microbiota that it's beneficial. We looked at specific microbes also. Bifidobacterium, you know it's a beneficial microbe, and we saw great increase between the beginning, the end of treatment, and even after 2-year follow-up. And I mentioned to you before this, some microbes that we found were missing in kids with autism, including Prevotella, and you can see here that also in the beginning of our treatment they were almost depleted in the middle graph, and they increased dramatically at week 10, which is the end of our treatment. They decreased a little bit after 8 weeks and at the 2-year follow-up, but when we compare the 2 years later to the beginning, you can see that that amount of Prevotella is still much higher than our neurotypical kids, which is the green line here also. The sulfovibrio is a bacteria that is controversial. We put it here as beneficial microbe, but the sulfovibrio can also be harmful. But in our studies, we have seen a correlation between benefits and the sulfonylurea, and I have an hypothesis of what could be happening with this microbe. I want to mention, as Jim said, that the material that we used was very well screened, and that it needs to be done under very particular circumstances. So FMT is not a treatment that it's approved by FDA. And recently there was, you might have heard on the news, it happened that a patient that was immune compromised was treated with an FMT that had bacteria that were resistant to antibiotic treatment, and this patient died. So I always say this, and now I say it with more strength, do not try this at home. If you try this under the wrong conditions, the kids could get really sick, and this just proves it. So we were lucky to be working with a group that screens really well their material, screens really well the donors, and all of this was done under medical supervision.
So just to clarify, the case is actually 2 cases. 2 children became very sick and 1 died.
They were adults.
Thank you. I tend to say children, so thank you. But they had leukemia and they were severely immunocompromised. That was problem 1. And the second problem was that their donor, as he said, had a multiple drug-resistant bacteria, which had not been screened by that group. So the FDA then asked all companies, all groups doing research, to add new screening procedures. Well, the group we work with already had those screening procedures in place, so we just continued with our studies without pause. But again, it just shows it's very important to screen donors. Just like with a blood donation, you could catch hepatitis. That's what killed my mother. And so we want to be very cautious about this, so to screen both the donors and also to check that the individuals themselves don't have a major compromise of their immune system. But over 30,000 people have now been treated with microbiota transplant, and again, these are the only 2 cases I'm aware of serious injury. So just to summarize, children with autism seem to have abnormal gut bacteria. There are a lot of studies out there now. There's not necessarily very good agreement on what is different in their gut bacteria, but I'll just say in our 3 studies, we've consistently seen lower diversity and lower Prevotella, and some other groups have seen that as well. And so if children with autism are missing hundreds of different species of gut bacteria, then we think this microbiota transplant therapy is a promising, I want to emphasize the word promising method to restore a normal gut microbiome. But we still have a lot to learn. This is still a very much a fledgling therapy. In our first study, we were estimating what is the right dose. We were estimating what's the right duration. In our new studies, we're going to go to higher dose, longer duration, because in our cases, there were no adverse effects from the microbiota itself. So if you have something that's beneficial and not causing any adverse effects, then it makes sense to try a higher dose and see if you might see even more benefit. And because our first study was open label, we're now doing randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies to verify these results. The legal status is that based on our research, when TTU was granted fast-track status by the FDA, that means that they recognize that it's a potentially promising, not proven, but promising treatment for an unmet need. And again, as other speakers have alluded to, we do not have an FDA-approved medication for core symptoms of autism, and this is exciting because it seems to address all 3 core areas of autism. And I think seeing the mouse model work that Sarkis has done, I think makes very good sense. I think this might relate to one of the triggers that Bob Navio talked about so eloquently. This may be one way to reset the system. Again, the great thing about this treatment is it seems to be relatively long-lasting. Microbiota data that Rosie showed is at 2 years, diversity is even better than in typical kids, so we're very hopeful about it. But we still need phase 2 and phase 3 studies to become commercially viable. So we're currently with Dr. Rich Fry, I don't know if he's here now, but we're working on a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study with him. Already treated 18 adults. We plan to enroll another 66. And then we're also about to announce in just a few days our new child study, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study for 50 children with autism. So The child study, fully approved. We'll just announce the applications in a few days now that we've hired the study coordinators for it. The goal of both of these studies is to demonstrate efficacy in children and adults, to demonstrate that to optimize the dosing and duration to see if we can get even more efficacy than in our phase 1 study. We'd like to determine if vancomycin is needed or not. Vancomycin seems to be important for killing pathogenic bacteria, but it also causes some harm and kills some beneficial bacteria. So we're exploring to see if that's needed. So half the participants will receive it, half won't. And then we also, through the work that Rosie's been doing, which is so crucial, we really understand what bacteria are changing. We can better understand what are the causes of many of these problems and what are the symptoms. What I emphasize, there's been a lot of talk about the pathogens that these bacteria create, but it's equally important to consider the beneficial bacteria, which help us digest our food, which produce key vitamins, which help regulate our immune system. So it's not just getting rid of the pathogen, it's also improving the beneficial bacteria is, I think, equally important.
Forgot to mention that there is no placebo effect or bias in the microbiome measurement. So that is a measurement done in the lab. So some reviewers could argue that we had a large placebo effect, but I showed you all that we changed the gut microbiome. It was a dramatic change, and we changed it, and there's no placebo effect there. So we're looking for mechanisms also.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the mouse model work that Tarkus has been doing is also very helpful to that. We have many groups who have been helping us with this. We've received funding from Arizona Board of Regents. Finch Therapeutics provided the material we used for our first study and funding for a follow-up study. Department of Defense is helping fund our adult study. We ran a little bit low on funding due to an unexpected problem. We're so blessed that over 1,000 families helped to raise the couple $100,000 that we needed to continue that study. So we're going to be announcing the continuation of that very soon. We're just waiting for one last signature from the DoD. We'll be continuing that very soon. And then also, we're so thankful to another 1,000 families who asked us to do a child study. And we said, okay, we'll try. And within 2 months, they raised $1 million for us. A special thanks to the Fearfully and Wonderfully Made group, who are major contributors, and also we had some and they're here today, I believe. I'm not quite sure exactly where, but if someone, there they are. Thank you. My peripheral vision isn't so good. So many thanks to you. And we also had some anonymous donors who, again, many thanks to them. ARI, the Autism Research Institute, funded some of our early pilot work. The FDA has been super helpful to us with guidance. We're very appreciative of them. They have a high bar for what we need to do, but they've been very helpful. And of course, the many families who participated in our study were kind enough to let us even follow up with them 2 years later.
I want to add to that I have run other clinical trials, and I have never seen a clinical trial where no one drops out. So these families were amazing. We did not have dropouts, and they actually, not only they didn't drop out, but 2 years later they participated. So we have to thank them. They were amazing. I've never seen such a committed population for a study.
And then a special thanks to Sid Feingold for his pioneering work in doing many of the studies that really pointed the way to abnormal gut microbiome and autism. And also to Ellen Bolte, who was the autism mom whose child had those problems, and she was the one who got Sid on board. So they've been just very, very important. And I will mention finally, just this last week, we had 2 new papers published on MTT for autism. One is it's an expert review written primarily for clinicians on where we think the field is and what are some of the challenges and hopes in the field in the next few years. And then secondly, we just published a very interesting paper on looking at the metabolites in children with autism. We measured 600 metabolites in blood and in stool. We discovered many of these were very different in children with autism. In our before treatment, with just 3 of those metabolites, we could distinguish the autism versus the typical kids with about 95% sensitivity specificity. And then after treatment, many of those metabolites improved, and now the children are much more similar metabolically to the typical children, and no longer met that autism diagnostic test for the most part. So I think, again, as Sarkis and others have pointed out, it's great to have tests that can help guide our treatment. What's equally interesting, I think, though, is the metabolites that did not change, because those are targets of opportunity, of things that we still need to work in addressing. This is not a cure, this is an improvement, and result in any improvement, long term, my goal is 100% improvement. So I just wanted to share that, and I think we're out of time, so thank you all very much.